Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, how challenging is Elden Ring? The question is simple in nature, and yet every single person is likely to give you a different response. After all, the difficulty of the game is based entirely on your own journey through it, your experiences with each and every enemy, and of course, it's rooted heavily on the playstyle that you chose. What if I told you, though, that there was one playstyle that I used that just sort of completely removed all challenge from 95% of the bosses and enemies in the game? A build that could kill Moog without letting him even do a real attack to you, that could kill dragons with minimal challenge, that could even stagger lock late game bosses. Well, today it's time to take a look at something just a little bit nutty, the Fallingstar Beastjaw Colossal Weapon. And as opposed to most colossal weapons, its size doesn't really matter to you while using it. Its scaling doesn't really matter either. Hell, the vast majority of the moveset means absolutely nothing to your experience while wielding it, because no matter what you do with it is tiny and insignificant if you aren't just using the weapon's unique skill, Gravity Bolt. When you hit the button after a short delay, a big purple rock formation will come out of the ground under your target, dealing a large amount of damage and a good amount of stagger too. This thing is super strong, and if you hit the Ash of War button multiple times in a row, it cuts out the majority of the animation, making it incredibly spammable.
So I just keep on doing it.
Some enemies will try to close the gap, they'll have fast reactions and reasonably good combos that make this hard to use in that way, but that is few and far in between compared to the amount of things that will just get blasted at a pretty long range away from you with rapidity until they fall over, on one knee, giving you even more opportunity to spam this as much as your FP and stamina allow. So, what is involved in making this as good as it is, as good as it can get? And my favorite question, how good can it get? Because, well, this is a weapon that built in this way will be effective far into multiple New Game Plus levels, as the way that it scales and the ways that you can take advantage of it will give you somewhere smart to put your attribute points well above what you'll achieve in your first or maybe even second playthrough. And that said, even using this setup with the more or less minimum requirements will still kick the ass out of most things you go against, especially gravity-based enemies, as it should be noted that this thing has a neat little hidden bonus of an extra 20% damage to gravity NPCs. In PvP as well, this ability is quite strong. It's somewhat easy to dodge if they see what you're holding and know what it is, but even then, if you purposefully time the inputs a bit offbeat, then their roll spamming won't help them all the time. It will almost always two-shot someone when it hits, and even if you can only hit them once with the skill, you then have a significantly lower health opponent while you are wielding a colossal weapon, giving you quite the advantage overall to play around. How does it come together then? Well, the weapon itself is clearly extremely important to the process, and we've already talked about what it is, so if you want it for yourself, then you have to defeat the full-grown Fallingstar Beast boss located at the very top of Mount Gelmir, right beside the 9th Mount Gelmir campsite, Site of Grace. The extra interesting part of this that makes it have such a high potential is the way that the damage of the attack itself is split. It doesn't care about your weapon damage itself and instead scales purely off of attributes. It is around 70% physical damage and 30% magical damage, with the physical part of the damage scaling with your strength and dexterity, and the magical damage part scaling with your intelligence. So realistically, the absolute maximum scaling that this weapon can reach for this skill would have you maxing out 3 different attributes. As it both deals physical and magical damage as well, you can buff it with things that boost either one, and of course this means that each buff will be a lesser overall bonus than it would be with a weapon that was 1 pure damage bonus, but this means that you can apply buffs together that normally just wouldn't work. For example, because magic damage is 30% of the weapon skill, that means if you were to use something like the Magic Scorpion Charm Talisman, which applies a 12.5% bonus to magic damage, it would only actually be around a 3 to 4% damage bonus on the skill as a whole, which makes it much less valuable than it would normally be in another set. But in a game where you have a limited number of damage buffs for each type of damage, and more often than not, there is an extra slot or 2 available in builds that only use 1 type of damage, a multi-type weapon has an extremely high cap.
It gives you focus, makes you stronger.
So let's talk about the talismans then. Obviously the biggest boost that we can get is simply the Shard of Alexander talisman. This one boosts your weapon's skill damage by 15%, and that of course applies to both damage types. It's just super strong on any build that is focused around an Ash of War, and of course this build is almost entirely focused on using Gravity Bolt well. You get this one from following Alexander around the map a little bit, with the first step being in the desert where you fight Radon, the second one being in the west of Seathwater Terminus in the magma pools, and then the final one being in Crumbling Farum Azula by the Dragon Temple Rooftop Site of Grace. After that is a talisman that seldom gets used these days, Radagon's Source Seal. If any builds, it is questionable whether it is worth it or not. It has the potential to give you a lot of attribute points of worth, essentially being worth entire levels for the trade-off of a non-inconsequential amount of damage negation reduction. Because of the specific stat spread of this build, because of how attribute hungry it is and how high the ceiling is, it actually makes sense to use this here. The 5 points of vigor are always great, of course. The endurance lets you wear somewhat heavier armor than you would have without it, and then with the weapon skills physical component being boosted equally by strength and dexterity, having 5 points of each is just a ton of value from one talisman. We use this here instead of the Magic Scorpion Charm talisman, simply because having both on would be super hard to play with. You'd get just about one shot by most difficult enemies, and because this talisman simply results in more damage gain for the attack than the Magic Scorpion talisman does, boosting the pure magic component of the attack. To get the Source Seal, head to the top of Fort Faroth in Caelid and jump around the rafters to find it near some rats. After that, as this is an extremely spammable weapon skill, and as that is our main goal here to apply damage, we have the Carrion Filigreed Crest to back it up, lowering the cost of our weapon skill usage by 25%, which simply allows us to cast 25% more before needing to take a break to drink a flask. To get this one, simply buy it from War Counselor Iji at the Road to the Manor Site of Grace after you have pledged yourself to Ranni the Witch. And then the final slot is somewhat free game to do with as you will, but since this is a somewhat ranged build that can absolutely stagger lock enemies, my recommendation is the Ritual Sword Talisman. This increases your damage by 10% when you're at full health. It isn't necessarily as consistently easy to keep yourself at full health as a proper ranged build, but it isn't a melee build either, and so you will definitely get good use out of this talisman, especially at the beginning of a fight. To get it for yourself, you'll have to kill the boss located down the stairs of the Lux Ruins in the Altus Plateau. For your wondrous flask of Physick mixtures, we have the Magic Shrouding Cracked tier, which gives you a solid 20% boost to your magic damage overall, evening out to around 6.5% boost to your weapon skill due to the way the damage is split up. And then secondarily, I would heavily recommend the Stone Barb Cracked tier, which makes your poise breaks easier to achieve, as this weapon deals a lot of poise damage, and leaning into that simply lets you spam the ability even harder without needing to take breaks to dodge attacks. The Magic Shrouding Cracked tier is found by killing the boss at the Minor Erd Tree on the eastern side of Liurnia, and the Stone Barb Cracked tier is dropped by the boss at the Minor Erd Tree in the northeast section of Caelid. After this, we dive into the spells of this build, and I am purposefully being ambiguous by using the word spells here.
You know a good magician never reveals his secrets.
Except this one, a beautiful mixing of both sorcery and incantations to fuel our multi-damage type weaponry. First up, and obviously you need a staff to cast it, but any staff will do as it isn't affected by scaling at all. Terra Magica. This puts a circle on the floor under you to increase your magic damage while standing inside of it by 35%. This translates to nearly 12% overall bonus damage on our weapon skill of choice here. It can be a bit hard to stay inside of the circle while also avoiding your enemy, but this is more of a pure damage bonus thing that you can do whenever it is safe to do so, rather than something required to make the build work in the first place. This one is found by following the path at the end of the Academy Crystal Cave in Liurnia. After the boss, you'll find quite the long elevator leading up to the top of a tower, with this spell located inside of a chest. Then for our incantations, you'll need a seal, and which kind doesn't really matter. Normally I'd recommend something like an elephant seal, because they're really hilarious and awesome, but I guess in this case anyone with 0 weight is probably a smarter choice. As again, like Terra Magica, these aren't boosted at all by your incantation scaling. These two incantations that I've mentioned then are the very classic and oft-used choices of Golden Vow, which boosts your damage by 15% and your defense by 10% for 80 seconds after casting, and of course Flame Grant Me Strength, which boosts your physical and fire damage by 20% for 30 seconds after casting, which realistically is a 14% damage boost to the weapon skill itself. And that is every piece of equipment required to absolutely make this thing sing. Not sing, I guess, more just blah, as I guess that's the sound it makes, as well as where to get those things. So what stats do you want to aim for while using it? Well, that is where this one gets a little bit complex. At my level of 150, things are a little bit tight if you want to really push this thing to the max. 40 vigor is your absolute minimum, though if you have the levels, you want to get it up to 60 if you can. 40 strength and 40 dex is a really good soft cap to reach for the weapon skill damage, as they scale it quite equally. Though obviously if you have the spare points, again, more points into both of these stats is just more damage every time you cast the skill. 20 intelligence is your requirement, both to use the weapon as well as the exact amount needed to use Terra Magica. And if you have absolutely no other attribute left to raise other than this one, it's still viable to do so, as even though only 30% of the weapon skill's base damage is based off your intelligence, it still raises it a little bit nonetheless. Faith, you want to hit 25 in order to hit both of our incantations. Endurance, you want to reach whatever lets you be on medium equip load with the build, as well as your personal armor set of choice. And then finally, Mind is quite important for this one. I plugged it up quite high for the purpose of showing off how spammable and strong the stagger is on this attack, but you could definitely manage alright with 30 or even 25 if you don't have a problem drinking flasks more often. Personally, I quite like how unstoppable this thing feels with a ton of FP in your bar though. With that covered, you now understand just how stat hungry this thing is, but also how to take advantage of it with your stats the best way. My attributes, nowhere close to reach the actual ceiling of this weapon, and as I said earlier, even using it as minimum requirements is still extremely strong. The weapon itself is just ridiculously good, honestly. This build simply exists to amplify that in every way possible. How do you feel about the geology stick then? Do you want to fire rocks from the ground, or are you just along for the ride for another crazy build? Like if you like the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.